This video will be examining deaf culture, what it is, who is in it, and the diversity of lived experiences within the deaf community. The deaf community, like other communities, can be defined as a network of people with past common experiences and shared language and culture. The deaf community is commonly regarded as a minority group, both culturally and linguistically. Features that characterize deaf community as a unique people group included having a language, social institutions, history, kinship, and a distinct culture, often referred to as deaf culture. Cultures are developed around people's self-identity, including their experiences and their place in the world. It is natural for people who share these experiences and identities to come together. Cultures become stronger over time and through generations. Deaf culture is primarily visual, and their culture surrounds this principle. Al Jazeera spoke to Lindsay Dunn, a professor at the American University for the Deaf, who defined deaf culture. He suggested deaf culture is complex, and there are many diverse deaf cultures around the world. In every place a different language is spoken, there is an associated deaf culture which has its own characteristics and is influenced by the wider national identity. Deaf culture can be described as all the beliefs, values, and customs that are transmitted through the culture's unique language, institutions, and art, in a deaf community. A common feature of deaf cultures is pride and a focus on the positive opportunities and close-knit community, which arise from shared experiences, instead of seeing deafness as a disability or impairment. So, who belongs to the deaf community? Not everyone who is deaf, either completely or partially, will associate themselves with the deaf community. Aussie Deaf Kids suggest that those who belong to the deaf community include people who use Auslan, whether they are deaf or hearing, people deaf from birth or an early age, hearing children of deaf adults, and some hearing people who live and work with deaf people. In Australia, the unifying factor of the deaf community is the use of Auslan, the Australian Sign Language. Not all members of the deaf community are profoundly deaf, many are only moderately deaf. Some who are deaf may choose to not use Auslan, and generally speaking are therefore not included in the deaf community. There are deaf people from all cultural backgrounds, ethnicities, socio-economic groups, religions, and gender identities. These deaf people are all linked through their shared experience of deafness, and most importantly, their shared language. The small size of the deaf community and limited numbers of deaf education programs means that deaf people who come from very different backgrounds come into close contact with each other. But, how big is the deaf community? There are not a great deal of available statistics concerning the size of the Australian deaf community, and the incidence of signing deaf people in Australia varies from 7,000 to over 15,000 between studies. One widely acknowledged estimate is from Hyde and Power, who suggested there were about 15,400 deaf people who used signs in Australia and possibly 15,000 hearing users of sign language. As belonging to the deaf community is often related to cultural and linguistic identity, rather than hearing ability, only a proportion of this group may consider themselves part of the deaf community. 1 in 6 Australians are affected by hearing loss, with prevalence rates increasing with age. By 2050, hearing loss is projected to increase to 1 in every 4 Australians. This suggests the size of the deaf community could increase in the future. Now, we will look at the lived experiences of people in the deaf community. People in the deaf community share difficulties with being heard and social interaction, especially in large groups, but have quite diverse lived experiences, receiving different supports, and opting for different communication techniques. We are going to find out more about 2 individuals who are part of the deaf community. Ellie Parfitt, a blogger, and Dean Buckley, who was interviewed and shared his experiences on the Attitude YouTube channel. Ellie Parfitt, or Deaf E-blogger, as she is often known as, is a UK-based deaf blogger and activist. She has had bilateral sensory neural hearing loss since birth, wears hearing aids, and communicates through speech and lip reading. Ellie's motto is, "Deaf people can achieve anything they dream of, given the right support." Our second individual, Dean Buckley from New Zealand, was born deaf as a result of Golden Hair syndrome, a rare congenital defect characterized by incomplete development of the ear, nose, soft palate, lip and mandible. Dean is a deaf activist, a youth member of parliament and a prefect on the board of trustees at his school. Let's compare Ellie and Dean's schooling experiences as members of the deaf community. Ellie attended a boarding secondary school, as she thought that she would be unable to reach her full potential at a local high school. Throughout school, Ellie used radio aids and hearing aids. Dean Buckley attends Kelston Boys High School. Ellie and Dean both struggled to find friends during school and worried about people's opinions. Ellie found that she never made any close friends and was always the last to be chosen for group work. Her friends never repeated her when she misheard them. Ellie thinks that having a learning support assistant acted as a barrier, and made it awkward for peers to talk to her. This was made harder when Ellie couldn't talk to friends, because she wouldn't be able to lip-read the teacher. Ellie experienced constant paranoia that the students were judging her, and was sometimes asked why she sounded weird. Dean had a similar experience. He felt isolated and like he needed to hide who he was at school, leading to stress and depression. Dean also stated feeling alone and judged by others, due to his communication barriers. Like Ellie, he did not have many good friends. Dean and Ellie both struggled with concentration fatigue at school. They experienced tiredness from the effort of concentrating and lip reading. Ellie's eyes stung during class and she would often feel drained. Both Ellie and Dean sometimes fell asleep in class and encountered misunderstanding teachers. They both experienced the burden of the extra effort required to engage at school because of their hearing loss. The communication assistance techniques Dean and Ellie used at school are different. Ellie had a learning support assistant next to her, and used a device to amplify the teacher's voice over background noise. Ellie also had a note-taker and regular breaks to assist her. Differently to Ellie, Dean has an interpreter in the classroom, and doesn't have a note-taker. Dean finds it difficult because he can only watch the interpreter, or teacher, or look down to take notes. Dean also takes photographs of the board to aid his learning. Dean and Ellie also share the experience of communicating with large groups. Dean communicates using New Zealand Sign Language outside of his home, and Total Communication Sign at home. Using New Zealand Sign helps Dean communicate with groups friends who are also deaf. Unlike Dean, Ellie can use hearing aids, and her parents taught her oral speech, rather than sign language, which Ellie learned later in life. Ellie's oral speech has helped her communicate with groups of people outside of the deaf community. Dean finds this difficult, as most people outside the deaf community do not understand sign language. Both Ellie and Dean struggle to communicate in large groups. They both find keeping up with conversation in bigger groups hard, as it involves fast transitions from topic to topic. Dean and Ellie find it hard to join in, as they must gain attention from the group physically, before communicating. However, their family and friends support them in such situations. At large family gatherings, Ellie sometimes finds it hard to see what everyone is saying. Ellie's family support her by looking straight at her in good lighting, and taking turns, so she can lip read. Dean has 4 siblings and sometimes finds it hard to get his voice heard. His family support him in a different way to Ellie, by learning sign language to communicate with him. His parents also taught him Total Communication Sign, which includes finger spelling, gestures, vocalizations, and sign language. This increases Dean's communication capacity in large groups, including his family. As we have seen, the deaf community is not just a minority group of people with complete hearing loss and the same experiences. Rather, it is expansive and diverse, including a wide range of people with varying degrees of hearing loss. Just as there is diversity among people of the deaf community, there is great diversity among their lived experiences. This is important as it influences how these people are treated by those outside the deaf community. With greater knowledge about the deaf community and their perspectives, social barriers and difficulties can be reduced, and we can foster authentic understanding.